Morning, everybody. Sorry I was a little late. Had some updates, had to restart. Why don't we get going if everybody's here?
Yep, that works.
Everybody here?
Yes.
All right, I call this meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization Administration and Finance Committee to order. Does somebody want to call the roll to establish a quorum, please?
Yes, I can do that, Mr. Chair. MBTA Advisory Board,
Brian Kane, present.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council, MassDOT.
I see that Len's running just a couple minutes late. He says he'll join us soon as well. Thanks.
Great. MassDOT Office of Transportation Planning. Okay.
Here? Yeah.
Great, thank you. Metropolitan Area Planning Council
Dennis Giambetti, present.
and Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
That was Dennis. I'm Eric Barassa with MAPC.
Sorry.
No problem. Sweating it out here.
I have to listen better.
You got promoted, Dennis.
You want my job, Dennis?
No, thanks.
All right, I'm going to read the notice of non-discrimination, not the notice of discrimination, the notice of non-discrimination. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. And I will now read the meeting guidelines. All participants will join with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. Participants may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate, please select the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. And I will do my best to call on participants as I see you. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Ethan Lapointe via the chat, via email at elapointe@ctps.org, or by phone at 857-702-3703. I will now read the accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Ethan Lapointe, MPO staff, via the chat, via email at elapointe@ctps.org, or by phone at 857-702-3703. Introductions. We sort of did that during the roll call. Sorry if I went out of order. We'll skip introductions. I'm Brian Kane. I'm the Executive Director of the MBTA Advisory Board, and I'm chairing this meeting. You can direct all complaints to me. Does anyone have any public comments to make at this time? You can use the raise hand function and we'll do our best to call upon you. I see 18 participants and no hands shooting up, so we will assume that public comment is closed. And our first action item is the summary of the May 11th, 2023 meeting. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, or would anybody like to make a motion at this time?
I'll make a motion to approve those meeting minutes.
Second.
Eric, thank you, Dennis. Sylvie, can you call the roll?
Yep, Brian King,
Yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Yes.
Derek Cravat,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassi, yes.
and Dennis Giambetti.
Yes.
Okay, that's all, Mr. Chair.
And that is approved. Our second item is the summary of the May 18th, 2023 meeting. Eric, I wonder if you would like to make a motion with respect to this item.
I will make a motion also to approve the May 18th meeting summary.
Wow, what a guy. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dennis. Sylvie?
Brian Kane,
Yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Yes.
Miranda Bernesso,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
and Dennis Giambetti.
Yes.
That's all, Mr. Chair.
And our third action item is the summary of the June 1, 2023 meeting. Eric, don't hold us in suspense.
Sorry, yes, I will make a motion to approve the June 1st meeting summary.
Second.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Eric. Sylvie?
Brian Kane,
Yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Yes.
Miranda Braceno,
Here, yes, whoops, wrong one.
It's all
Eric
good.
Barassa,
Eric Barassi, yes.
and Dennis Giambetti.
Yes.
Approved, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Silva. Appreciate it. Okay, state fiscal year 2023 year end budget update by the great Haral Gandhi and the amazing Silva, who I've been calling Sylvie. My apologies. And I'm not going to try to butcher your last name, so you'll have to tell me how to pronounce it because I can't get your first name right. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rahul Gandhi. I'm the Director of Finance and Operations at CTPS, and Silva Ivazian, who is the Project Accountant at CTPS. We will be given a brief update on where we ended state fiscal year 23, which ended on June 30th of this year. So before Silva provides the details on the operating budget, I wanted to briefly just go over our successes and challenges for the year and where we ended the fiscal year. So in the last 3 years, I've been reporting that prior to FY23, the last 3 years, we experienced a deficit in our operating budget. And this year, our goal was to offset that deficit and either have a surplus where our revenue exceeded our expenses, or to have a balanced budget where the revenue equaled the expenses. And we did end up with a surplus at the end of state fiscal year 23 for about $250,000. We also, when we're looking at the full fiscal year, we look at our net change in positions. So where we started the fiscal year and then where we end up. And then we look at that over the last 3 years, like a rolling period of last 3 years. So from SFY21 to SFY23, the average change in net position was close to 1%, which is, we try to stay within a 3% range over the last 3 years. And so over the 3 years when we had the deficit, and then this year having a surplus, we ended up kind of leveling out that change, that net change in position. The net position at the end of fiscal year 23 is about $651,000. And then regarding the funding sources, we were able to procure the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant last year towards the end of the year, which resulted in higher funding for the agency for this state fiscal year. We did see a decrease in MassDOT contracts last year, so the Safe Streets for All or other grants will kind of offset that change or that decrease. Another major success for the year, I would say, is we had an unusual mid-year salary increase for staff that resulted in, well, we tried to support our recruitment efforts and try to have a lower staff turnover rate. And due to the market trends, we were able to provide that unusual mid-year salary increase. We also, as I had mentioned last couple of reporting cycles, we were able to change our accounting practices to spread out the expenses over the entire fiscal year for purchases that were over $10,000. We started that partway through the year, so we should see a more stable budget throughout each period this year. What we were seeing in the past was we would have increased expenses all in July because all of our IT contracts or all of our major expenses happened, and we were recognizing those expenses in the month that we paid the invoice. But now we have changed our accounting practice that we pay the invoice, but we recognize the expense on our books over 12 months. So that way it's more of a steady budgeting process and looking at the trends. It's just, there's less ebbs and flows. And then we also, I think, a major change in the office operations was that we transitioned from remote work to hybrid work, and that resulted in some investments in our hybrid work technologies. We were able to support our staff with virtual meeting equipment, and then also some office furniture such as standing desks and new office chairs that were much overdue. So we were able to invest in those. And I saw Jen shaking her head. She experienced that. And then on the IT front, we also invested in hardware and software for increased cybersecurity. So those were some of the investments for the agency. And then on the challenges front, I would say recruitment continued to be somewhat challenging for us over the last fiscal year. It took longer to fill positions than we had anticipated. Our employee count it hovered around 50 when we had anticipated about 60 full-time staff members. So we would post positions and it would just take longer to recruit for them. And we still have many openings. And then the not being able to charge down the contracts because we didn't have the staffing, our contracts weren't charged down as we had anticipated, which Silva will explain in the next couple of slides. And that leaves some unobligated funds on the table. So for example, for federal fiscal year 23, the MPO contract, we're gonna probably have about $500,000 in unobligated funds at the end of September. And that money either sits on the table or goes away. We're not able to roll it over. And so we just have to manage, I think we have to manage those funds closely and try to spend down the MPO funds as much as possible in the next couple of years. Now I'm going to hand it over to Silva to provide a detailed breakdown of our operating budget.
Great, thank you, Harold. So next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at the numbers. Our first table here shows a quarterly summary of our revenue and expenses. So looking at the revenue row, we see a bit of a trend in our revenue for each quarter. In quarter one, our revenue was around 1.4 million. Quarter two, it was around 1.5 million. Quarter three, our revenue was at its peak at 1.6 million, and then it fell back down a bit in quarter four to 1.5 million. The reason that we saw such a peak in quarter three is a few reasons. One of them is that typically in quarter three of the year, staff work is really at its peak, where project managers are trying to close out all their projects before the end of the year. But another reason that impacted our revenue in quarter three is that we did have a mid-year salary adjustment, as Harel mentioned, which was unusual, and it was done just because of the market circumstance last year. So that increase in staff salary also led to an increase in our charging, therefore impacting our revenue for quarter three. Ultimately, we finished the year with our total revenue being at 6.12 million. Now, looking at our expenses for the year, there isn't necessarily a trend from quarter one to quarter four. In quarter one, we were around 1.4 million. quarter two also closer to 1.4 million, quarter three at 1.5, and quarter four also at 1.5. The reason that our expenses have been quite steady throughout the quarters, one of the reasons, excuse me, is that, as Harel mentioned previously, the way that we have been expensing our big invoices is that usually prior to last year, when we would receive a major invoice, we would just pay it upfront. Whereas now, what we've been doing is that we've been spreading it out within a 12-month period. And so that's why, in order to keep our expenses steady from quarter to quarter. But I also want to mention that when it comes to our expenses, we do have major IT-related expenses that do occur in quarter one and in quarter four. Overall, we finished the year with our expenses being at 5.89 million. So looking at the very last row, our surplus and deficit, we did start the year a bit low, and then our surplus increased to 92,000 in quarter two, and it peaked in quarter three at 147,000. Ultimately, in quarter four, our surplus was at 31,900. The reason that it fell from quarter three to quarter four is that we saw that we had a major surplus in quarter three, and so we invested in some office furniture for the staff, and we purchased standing desks for the staff, as well as new chairs for everyone at the agency. So we really wanted to take advantage of our surplus and make some big investments at our agency. And so our quarter four surplus went down to about 32,000. Ultimately, we finished the year with a surplus of about $230,000. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here we actually have a visual of our revenue throughout the year. If we look at the bottom, we have our different funding sources. So we have our MPO funded projects, MassDOT SPR projects, MassDOT other projects, as well as MBTA and some other contracts with smaller municipalities such as the City of Boston. So this graph shows our different funding sources, as well as what we had projected for each funding source compared to what we actually charged. If we look at the MPO and MD directed PL funded projects, through SFY23, we had expected a revenue of about 5.4 million, but we actually charged about 4.9 million. So we charged 91% of what we had expected to charge. MassDOT SPR, we charged about 63% of what we had projected for last year. MassDOT other, and just an example of the MassDOT other funded projects, these are projects such as the Wellington Circle, as well as MassDOT on-call projects. We were charged about 85% of what we had projected. And as far as our MBTA contracts, we had projected to charge 702,000, and we charged 692,000, about 98% of the way. Overall, our total column there that we see for SFY23, we projected our revenue to be at 6.9 million, but it fell a bit under at 6.12 million. About 88%, we charged about 88% of what we had expected. And Harel did mention a few of these points, how throughout the year, although we have spent a lot of time on recruitment, it has taken longer to fill those spots. And so not having enough staff on board has also resulted to us not being able to charge out contracts. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our next slide here shows a visual of our expenses. So again, when it comes to the agency's expenses, we have admin-related expenses such as employee benefits, office supplies are fixed expenses. We also have direct labor as well as direct costs. So looking at our admin expenses, we had projected to end the year at 3.7 million for our admin expenses, but we actually ended at around 3 million. In terms of direct labor, we had expected to have 3.1 million, but we ended a little bit under and came in around 89% of what we had projected. Overall, our total for the year, we had projected to be at 6.9 million, the same as our revenue, of course, but unfortunately we fell a little bit under and we actually ended at 5.9 million for the year in terms of our expenses. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So we also wanted to provide an update on our overhead rate. Due to our revenue and our expenses, as well as a lot of our investments, our overhead rate for the year, we actually ended at around 1.9%, whereas we had projected to be at 119.34%. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for your time, and if there are any questions, please feel free to ask.
Okay, Haral, all set on your end?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I have a few questions, but I see Dennis has put his thumb up. Dennis, is that for a question or are you just being sportive? Now the thumb has come down.
Sorry, question. I have a question.
That was
Like
your Arthur Fonzarelli impersonation. I get it.
right.
Go ahead, please.
So when you speak about revenue and you talk about contracts, is that one and the same? So your projection for revenue was X. Is that being the number of the value of the contracts was X that you projected, and what was the actual contracted number? Am I confusing you a little bit?
No, that makes sense. So yes, the revenue is the same as our funding source. So we went at the beginning of the budget year, we anticipate different funding sources. So MPO is 75% of our funding. MassDOT contracts account for about 10, and BTA contracts account for about 10. And that is what we consider our revenue source. Does that answer that question?
And I guess I'm not quite sure how to ask the question. I'm just trying to get the difference between contract and revenue source. So are they one and the same?
So contracts fall in a different calendar cycle than the revenue. So revenue is assumed for the state fiscal year. So right now, if we look at just MPO contract, we have 2 MPO contracts that fall within one state fiscal year. So because the MPO contracts are on a federal fiscal year cycle and our operating budget is on a state fiscal year, we have to account for 9 months of one contract and 3 months of another contract for the MPO funding.
I think there might be one other layer here, Dennis, and let me know if this is also helpful or not, which is that we may get a contract in place, for example, for the MPO funds themselves. And let's just say it's a round number, like $5 million. As you know, as we talked about a bit, if we do not have the full staff capacity, currently hired and on board, we may not actually charge to the full amount of that contract. So our actual revenue could be, only 90% of that contract amount. So the contract is sort of the full available revenue that we have, but we may only charge out a portion of that contract depending on our staffing levels or other factors. Is that also maybe partly what you're trying to parse out?
Yeah, maybe I'll ask the question a little bit differently. Did we get more contracts than we projected, or did we get less contracts than we projected?
Sorry, Gina, can you go to the revenue slide a little bit? Maybe 2 slides before that one. Thank you. So on this slide, we had projected the MPO to be 5.43 million. That was what was assumed. However, if you look at the other columns, we had projected 80,000 in contracts throughout like the towns, the municipalities. We just projected that we would have about few contracts come through, but we ended up getting less contracts than what we had anticipated. So it depends on the funding source more so than like throughout. So throughout the year, we probably saw less contracts than what we had expected, which was okay because we didn't have the staff to kind of work on the project. So that's also, it was projected, but we didn't have enough capacity to take on more work anyway.
Gotcha. Now I understand. Okay, good. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Dennis. Brad Rawson, thank you for joining us, sir.
My pleasure, Brian. Great presentation, staff. Thank you. And I just want to maybe offer some specificity to illustrate, I think, some of the dynamics that Dennis's question was just exploring, but it leads to another question. Here, all on that example of other contracts where municipalities may seek to contract with CTPS. For example, Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville are working with you all right now on a fare equity study focused on the public bike share system, Blue Bikes. We started scoping and contracting with you all about a year ago, but then I think for a variety of client side reasons, we were slower to get off the ground than we wished originally. Is that discrepancy or lag reflected in the 80,000 projected and the 18,000 actual? Is that a good example of how a client side bottleneck could actually have implications for MPO cash flow?
Yes, absolutely. That's a good way to explain it. It depends on when the contracts actually come through. We can project, for example, like Silver Line, Wellington, the Blue Bikes, the example you gave. We can have conversation with project managers at the client, with our clients at the MBTA, MassDOT, and we put in those assumptions based on conversations. But until the contract actually comes through, we can't recognize that revenue until we invoice for it.
Brian, can I ask one follow-up question?
Of course.
And I don't know if this is for you, Hiral, if it's Tegan or both, but what are the risk factors associated with maybe bigger ticket client assignments in the case of a Mass DOT or MBTA sponsored initiative? If those agencies are behind schedule on a project and you're carrying extra cash on the books, is there a use it or lose it risk? We struggle with this all the time in municipal government.
Tegan, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'm happy to let you add in or start, but yes, that is a risk. We every year when we're doing our budgeting process, we are making assumptions of what will and won't come in, and we're making our staffing plan, right, based on how much revenue we think we'll have access to. And so it is never certain, and it evolves throughout the year. And that's also one of the reasons why we like the idea of reporting to this committee on a quarterly basis, just to sort of have more transparency throughout the year as to challenges or opportunities that we are facing throughout the year and how things might be changing. So it's kind of a constant moving target, both on the recruitment and staffing side, as well as on the contract and sort of revenue side of things. I think what we do have in terms of our agency is that MassDOT and the MPO and MassDOT directed PL sort of bucket is a more predictable and a large portion of our budget. And so that helps with a level of stability. And then these additional funds we treat as sort of higher risk. These other sources of contracts are sort of higher risk than the MPO and MassDOT directed PL contract is. But they all have some risk because there's a change in the obligational authority throughout the year from the federal government, which can affect how much money we actually have access to, even in that bigger contract.
So it's a series of moving targets that you're doing your best to estimate 12 to 18 months in advance. And yeah, I get you.
That sounds familiar, right? For a lot of people.
Absolutely. I had a couple of questions, if I might, or let me, comments, then a question. So I think expensing long-term costs over the 12-month year is really smart. I never liked the big spikes we were seeing in July. So, great job on that, or June or whenever it was. And I'm fully supportive, and I believe this committee is of the investments that were made in supporting the hybrid work environments. getting the proper equipment in the offices and comfortable chairs. I mean, we spend a lot of time in these things, so it makes sense to do that. And I think those are investments that will pay off in the long term, and hopefully in terms of retention and fewer backaches as all of us age. So that's really good, and I'm heartened to hear that. And I would encourage you to continue that if there are things that can be done within reason to support folks who are working at home with comfortable chairs there and stuff like that. Now, and that brings me to this question about this 230K surplus, which is, what do we do with that? What happens next?
Carol, do you want to start?
Sure. So the surplus and deficit work in a way that really it's not our money, right? It doesn't sit in our bank account. We can't assume that as like a profit because we are a non-for-profit agency. So if the client does the audit that the contracts say that they can, so MassDOT can do an audit at the end of the federal fiscal year and say, okay, what was the overhead rate? And then they would, if we came in under our overhead rate or our projected overhead rate, we would have to pay, we are obligated to pay the remaining balance, the difference to MassDOT or the client. However, if we go over our projected overhead rate, then, if we stay within the contract amount, then we have the rights to actually bill for that difference. So it's almost like that money is there and we want to stay close to the zero surplus so that we don't have to pay back or invoice for that. So ideally, that surplus, we don't want a surplus or a deficit. We want a balanced budget every year.
And
So-
I'll just add to, I was gonna say, I'll
Please.
just add to that very slightly, which is why I think the fourth quarter look it's such an important time. Because if we are projecting a surplus at that point, we really want to try to spend down the surplus then so that we don't end up with a significant surplus or deficit at the end of the year. So that's another element of this. And then the other related, but not exactly the same item, is that we want our overhead rate to be as on target as possible based on our projections.
So is it fair to say that this is really it's a surplus on paper? There's not money sitting somewhere available. It's just this, we didn't bill for this and it's not really been realized. So, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I see head nods. So that's what I thought it was. I've always thought that the way this CTPS is funded makes very little sense. But hey, what do I know? Leonard.
Yeah, I'm vacillating between understanding this and not understanding this, because first I thought, okay, it is on paper, and then when Tegan said, when we get to fourth quarter, when we meet in the third quarter, we're looking at fourth quarter, if we see a surplus, we want to spend it down. So how do you go about then spending it down?
Well, why don't we go to the actually, Gina, if you don't mind going to the expenses page, and Harold, maybe you could explain a bit what our strategy was in that fourth quarter. Sorry, it's not this one. It's the first, maybe it's 2 slides up. My apologies. I think it's this one where you look at the quarterly. Yeah.
So when we see a surplus building up or our overhead rate much lower than what we had projected, we go back and look at what the admin expenses, what are the things that we had budgeted that we held off on due to, the staff size being small. We wanted to make sure we wanted to stay close to our revenue. So for the first couple of quarters, we make sure that we manage our expenses very closely so that we don't have a deficit throughout the quarters. But then as we get closer to quarter 4, we know what our salaries are, how many staff we have, and what that surplus might look like. So we look at what expenses we had put on the back burner, what expenses we're projecting for the future fiscal year. Is there anything we can move up in this fiscal year to have that surplus be lower than what it is? And that way we have more wiggle room to work in the next state fiscal year with the budget. So There are a bunch of strategies we look at, and then are there any strategic level investments that we should be doing for the agency that we can't afford throughout the years because we saw a deficit in the last 3 years? Did we not do something because we knew that our overhead was way over our projected? And so we look at all of those things and we try to push those through.
Gotcha. So I'm hearing here maybe some studies from UPWP studies with a little flexibility, you know, in what they can do. I'm just kidding, only a little bit. Thank you.
Leonard.
I'm always about the UPWP, you know that.
Leonard. Throwing bombs.
No bombs, no bombs at all. You know, just lobbying hard for the UPWP. That's all.
As we all should. Mr. Rawson, please go ahead.
Yeah, Brian, again, forgive me for throwing out examples that may not be applicable, but in municipal government, we have financial law that allows us to deposit surplus funds, third-party funds for specific and unique purposes, subject to authorizing votes by our legislative bodies. I know that you know this, Brian. I know that Len knows this, Dennis knows this. What is the equivalent that is possible under federal law and state contracts for MPOs in general? Creating fiscal resilience, rainy day funds is a good strategic option for us because we know that the work still needs to be done. And I guess, you know, I'm asking the naive question about, is there any equivalency in federal MPO world about building up reserves so that they can be deployed consistent with approved planning strategies, plans, contracts, etc. The idea of living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, fiscal year to fiscal year, we have all acknowledged through the operations plan process has contributed to this organization sometimes being too subservient to our state agency partners. So I just want to ask the provocative question. Thanks again.
Why don't I start with that if that's okay with you, Brian?
Please.
Brad, that's a really good question. And it's also a really interesting question because MPOs work very differently across the country, depending on the types of relationships and contracts and processes that they've established in collaboration with their state in terms of using the federal funds. So the federal regulations, when you look at that largest contract, the combined PL and MassDOT directed funds, that's 75% or so of our budget. That one contract comes with a number. And when we don't have either the capacity or for other reasons, again, let's just use the round number. Let's say it was 5 million and we actually only billed 4.5 million of that contract. That leaves $500,000 of federal funds that we were eligible to use within this contract that we've signed with the state that we have not actually billed. So that $500,000 that is left over are still they're not real, they're not actual dollars yet, but they stay on the books as money that was allocated to the MPO that the MPO could use. So what happens is we're on a year-by-year contract with our state. And so when our contracts expire, we technically lose access to that additional $500,000. And so that becomes kind of a nebulous question of sort of what happens to those funds. And what happens is they sit in an accruing balance of unused federal funds. And at a certain point, the federal government allows, you know, through its regulations, it's an allowable access to those what we're calling carryover funds for, I think they call it 3+1, roughly 3 years. So you can actually access and use those funds from the federal perspective, but you need the contracting mechanism in place to be able to do that with your state and the accounting systems in place that allow for it. So this gets incredibly complicated. And MPOs do this very differently across the country, where some MPOs have established processes with their states, or they have multi-year contracts. And all of those different tactics have pros and cons associated with them. But what we find ourselves with now is we're engaged in a conversation with all the MPOs in the state where the federal government has acknowledged that there's an outstanding balance with those unused funds that needs to be spent down for the state to be competitive and eligible for other federal funds if they want to get additional funds. So incredibly complicated topic, and I'm sorry if I made it worse than better, but that's the main contract where there's some flexibility in terms of how we work with the state and with our federal partners to try to access some flexibility. So the other contracts, like if Mass DOT says, hey, you know, Boston MPO staff, we would love you to do a $50,000 modeling effort on this project. and we do it within $45,000, then we just do it within $45,000, right? We don't, that $5,000 doesn't stay, you know, in terms of like further access for us. So very different kinds of contracts, depending on, again, whether it's that federal funding source or funding sources otherwise.
Right. And I guess the other way to try to do this would be to increase the overhead rate. But I know there's lots of constraints on what that can be and what can be included in that. So it sounds like the multi-year contract with DOT is the preferred way to go. But I think we all understand the circumstances there. But yes, and I also agree with you, Brad. I certainly agree. And if need be, this committee can take a vote at some point on this to kind of recommend this, either a multi-year contract or some ability to retain surpluses, you know, and then kind of the carrot and the stick would be to take the state off the hook for deficits then in future years, so that CTBS wouldn't have to go back and try to, you know, bill them forever extra money, because I'm sure nobody likes that because they haven't budgeted for that. So there's a solution here that's eloquent for everybody. We just got to kind of find it. Brad, I saw your hand is up again. Please go ahead.
I'll try to keep my big mouth shut, Brian, but this conversation is helpful, and I'll look forward to reviewing the operations plan in this context. I feel like I'm learning. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Dennis.
Thanks, Brian. Quick question. I don't want to go off track a bit, but when you mentioned in third quarter that you saw a surplus coming in, there was a decision to purchase, or a decision was made to spend down the surplus. Who makes that decision? What's the process, and who makes that decision of, one, you're going to do it, and two, what you're going to do, what you're going to spend it on?
Aurora, why don't you start?
We do that at the leadership level. We gather information on what expenses we can incur. You know, there are logistics, what's realistic, and then at the leadership level, we discuss what to fund in Q4.
And Dennis, I should note that Tegan and Harald did come to me and ask me if I would be okay with this personally, and I approved it. As I said earlier, I think it's a good idea to support people working hybrid.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was just curious of where that decision goes. That's good. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah. The thing is, we also we stay within our budgeted amounts, the approved budgeted amounts. So we see something as low, like it's not that we're going over anything that was approved from the MPO as already.
Yeah, no, it just makes sense. I just was curious. That's all.
Okay. Thank you for great presentation. I mean, there's good news here. Obviously, it's always better to have more black than red, something those of us in transportation and finance are not used to. So this is good news. Unless there's any further questions, comments, we can move on to our next item, which is a goals update. Tegan.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to do a light touch on this topic today because it's new, and it's something that I think we should evolve together, sort of how this committee would like to hear from me as the executive director as I go through annual evaluations and establishment of goals for the agency. From my perspective, sort of what that report back looks like for this committee going forward. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So the reason why I'm here to talk about the goals I've established in my annual evaluation is because we have established that as a process in the operations plan. So what the operations plan says is that in May, I would submit a self-evaluation form to those in the MPO who would participate in a review of my performance. And that is now designated as the MPO chair, the vice chair, and the chair of the A&F committee, or their designees or alternates as they see fit. So that is something that has not started yet. Back in May, we did not have the operations plan in place yet. And so I did do an evaluation, a self-evaluation, and I was evaluated with the MPO chair and vice chair, but it wasn't yet following this process. And so we're kind of in a hybrid year where I'm trying to pull out the goals that were set in that process and discuss them with you on a quarterly basis this year. So the operations plan also specifies that in June is when the evaluation is finalized based on a conversation with the evaluators, and that a salary adjustment is confirmed for the executive director, which would be in effect as of July 1. And that's when all of the staff at the MPO receive their salary adjustments as well, but it's approved through a different process than this. And then the operations plan established this new practice where quarterly, so roughly in September, December, February, and May, when we do these quarterly check-ins to discuss the budget, I'd also like to do what the operations plan suggests in terms of reporting on progress towards the goals established in my evaluation. So, and then the idea is that we can discuss, and if the ANF committee sees fit, you could recommend, suggest updates to those goals throughout the year if, you know, context or conditions change in some way where you would recommend that. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to, again, like I said, I'm going to do a light touch on what my goals said in this past evaluation, recognizing that this past evaluation was done outside of this process. So again, this kind of needs to evolve. And I would say right now, I'm just going to kind of verbalize what those goals are established as being. But I think that in the future, we can certainly talk about different formats for providing updates that might make more sense to you. So I had a number of goals. I'm going to pull one out first that's actually already complete. I wanted to ensure that in this state fiscal year, we received the board approval of an operations plan, which was recommended in our federal certification review. And I'm very pleased to say that, you know, this committee in particular took a very, very heavy role in developing. And then we did get full board approval this year. I think, Brian, there might be some background noise coming through. Could I ask you to mute?
Oh, I apologize. My wife
That's
is
okay.
very loud.
All right. Thank you so much. I get distracted sometimes. So that one is complete. Next slide. So again, this is just a list right now. There are better ways to describe this, but just to give this initial light touch, some of my other goals included the following. So we have been and will, and let me, before I say all of these, let me just be very clear that these are not things that I accomplish alone in any way, shape, or form. Much of this is really ensuring that I'm supporting and facilitating the staff who are focused on these activities or the leadership who are focused on these activities in completing these activities. And I take part certainly sometimes very substantively, sometimes in ensuring that resources are allocated and sometimes in terms of approval. So it varies. But one item is that we have been on an ongoing basis revisiting employee policies and procedures that in particular this year, I want to determine which we may have already revised or we may have already started to address, but have may become less competitive in the last several years, especially based on the very quickly changing aspects of our job market and benefits that may be competitive in that job market. So we're going to continue to look at those. Just as an example, right now we're doing a deeper dive and look into our sick leave and FMLA policies. Another goal that I think I have had for several years in a row is to actually get to this full intended staff capacity. We keep talking about how it has been very challenging. We have seen, we have seen folks leave the agency, and that's not abnormal. A lot of agencies are seeing that. It's also it's becoming a more lengthy and kind of onerous process to really get through the full recruitment process and get people to replace those positions. So we've been putting a lot more investment, time, energy towards doing that in an efficient way, spending more resources to make sure that we're, advertising and engaging in recruitment to the best of our ability. And we would like to get up closer to our roughly 60 staff, our staffing plan of having at least 60 staff full-time engaged at the agency. One of the other goals that I want to keep very present is working to operate neither with a significant deficit or a significant surplus. So hopefully I don't have to explain that now. We've spent some time talking about that related to the budget. But we want to try to be as balanced as we can based on the way our funding sources work and our contracts and the potential for audits and things like that. So we are working very closely together, both CTPS staff and also the MAPC finance team. And we are working, I think, very diligently to do a really great job of managing and communicating the management of our revenues and expenses. Another big goal is to get the agency through the completion of the third year of our 5-year strategic plan. And I will just say that the strategic plan, which is available on our website, is a great representation of the agency as a whole goals and where we're trying to go over a 5-year period. So we are in year 3 now of that. Another goal that I take great ownership of is, of course, working with all of you to address the recommendations around the memorandum of understanding for the MPO, the additional recommendations that have come through in the federal certification reports, as well as in other forums where we've been discussing those. And right now we have an ad hoc committee that is being led by the Intercore Committee, Tom Bent, that is working to recommend processes that we can engage in to address those additional recommendations. We are also deeply in the process. It's a rather complicated process, but we are updating the fiduciary agent agreement with our fiduciary agent, which is MAPC. And when that is complete, it will also need to be brought to the board for approval. But it's really similar to the operations plan in some ways. It's really about providing transparency and clarity on roles and activities that we need to engage in with our fiduciary agent and vice versa. And the next slide. This is the last of them. We actually just were talking about the planning funds, the MassDOT combined funds, and the question around when there are excess funds that we're not able to use, what happens with those funds, what's the rollover, kind of how is that thought of? And that is related to this first bullet here, which is that my goal is to work with our state and federal partners, and also through, I'm sorry about the acronyms here, also through the other MPO managers across the state, as well as the regional planning agency directors across the state, to really establish more transparency around these kind of funding processes. And I have, the additional goal of introducing as much flexibility as we can, because I think we all have the common goal of wanting to use, to the best of our ability, as many of the federal funds available to us as possible in this state towards improving transportation in this state. And that is a common goal. And I believe that transparency and flexibility will move us closer to that goal. I have a very strong goal that I'm excited to work with my colleagues on, and we have been very understaffed in this regard, but we really need to develop a more robust onboarding and a more robust kind of ongoing engagement process with board members. So I've been doing a lot of individual work, and a lot of my staff do individual work, but we need more of a kind of a program and a framework set up to do that. And then lastly, we worked to start to have the first in-person / hybrid board meeting earlier this year. And I have a goal to support my staff and the board in reaching 3 to 4 in-person hybrid board meetings per year. Our next one likely being late in November as our annual meeting, which is also outlined in the operations plan. And so that is it in terms of what I've established. Again, I think it's kind of an interesting hybrid year. So I'm very open to, I know we're short on time. I'm open to either in this meeting or in the next meeting, more questions and comments on these goals themselves, and also any input on how you might like me to engage with this committee to talk about these goals, to establish these goals, and to update these goals throughout the year.
So Tegan, are you looking for us to eventually sort of approve these or recommend these to the full board? Or what is the kind of ask here?
This is the ask here is simply for you to engage in these goals, ask questions as you see fit. If you wish to recommend changes, you may certainly do that. And that would eventually would be brought to the board, but you don't need to formally approve these. I believe the language of the operations plan is that, and I'm sorry, I may have to triple check it, but that I develop these goals in collaboration with the chair, the vice chair, and the chair of this committee, Brian, and then present those goals to this committee as kind of an ongoing forum for transparency and reporting.
Got it. Okay, so for our next meeting, can you put this as an agenda item, just as a discussion amongst the committee members, and we'll sort of give ourselves the homework assignment of considering these, contemplating these, and we'll try to come back to that with suggestions, or at least have a discussion about it.
And I can one up you if you would like me to, which is that I could also propose. I could
you
also
always
propose,
do, Tegan.
Well, I'm putting more work on myself, but I would propose that I could potentially package these in a very simple format that would list them out and provide some level of update, and then you could have a chance to review that in advance, and then we could talk about that at the meeting. So
that would be helpful.
Yes, thank you very much.
Of course, yeah.
That kind of goes for everything. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, so we'll take that as a homework assignment for you, and then once you get that out to us for the committee. I notice we have 2 minutes left, so we'll leave that there.
Sorry, this was my next step slide. that
Oh,
I
I'm
forgot to
sorry.
mention.
I
My fault. No,
apologize.
I forgot it.
Go ahead.
So we just talked about this.
Okay. Yeah,
Fine.
this is good. This is good. Any member items? Seeing everybody shaking their head, would anybody like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Leonard Higgins.
Thank you,
Second.
Leonard. And my favorite, in my favorite David Moeller impersonation, without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Talk to you soon.